Imagine a young lady, beaten and sucked from home by her biological father, with the reason of becoming pregnant at a tender age. Meet Nolwazi, a girl whose shocking pregnancy brought shame to her family reputation. She was sucked from home by her biological father, and became homeless until the unexpected happens. Stay stunned, for you can't afford to miss this story, but if it is your first time here, then hit on the subscribe button, like, and turn on the notification button to stay updated of our next upload. Now let's dive into the full story. Nolwazi was the pride of her family, a beacon of grace and intelligence. The Ntuli family, known for their generational wealth and high social standing, held themselves above others in their community. The family patriarch, Bab'Ntuli, ruled with an iron fist, and nothing mattered more to him than the Ntuli name. One sunny afternoon, the Ntulis hosted a lavish engagement party for their eldest son, Themba. Friends, business partners, and socialites filled the grand hall, sipping on champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Nolwazi, dressed in an elegant gown, smiled as she mingled with guests, masking her growing anxiety. As the evening progressed, Nolwazi began to feel faint. The air grew heavier, her palms sweaty, and her heartbeat quickened. Before she could excuse herself, she collapsed onto the marble floor. Gasps echoed through the hall as guests rushed to her aid. When Nolwazi regained consciousness in the family's private lounge, the family doctor was already there. After a quick examination, the doctor's expression darkened. "She's pregnant," he announced. The room fell silent. Bab'Ntuli's face turned red with anger. "Pregnant," he bellowed. "Whose child is it?" Nolwazi stammered, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to tell you. But..." Her explanation was cut short by the sharp sting of her father's hand across her cheek. "We have no daughter," he declared, his voice echoing through the walls. The tension reached its peak as Nolwazi's grandmother, Ntuli, stepped forward. "Bab'Ntuli," she pleaded, "this is your child. Let us not act out of anger." But Bab'Ntuli silenced her with a raised hand. "Enough, Gogo. She has brought shame to our family." Without further discussion, he ordered the security guards to escort Nolwazi out. Humiliated, Nolwazi was dragged through the crowd as whispers and the flashes of phone cameras followed her into the cold night. The Ntuli estate's grand gates closed behind Nolwazi, leaving her standing in the dark. The night was colder than usual, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. She clutched her purse and walked aimlessly, her tears blurring the bright city lights. Eventually, Nolwazi found herself in a quieter part of town. She spotted an abandoned car parked behind a shopping mall. With nowhere else to go, she crawled inside, using her scarf as a blanket. The next morning, hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she had no money. Nolwazi wandered into a 24-hour diner nearby and asked for a job. The manager, a stout woman named Mondlovu, hesitated before giving her a trial shift washing dishes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Nolwazi going. At the diner, Nolwazi worked tirelessly, avoiding eye contact with customers. She feared running into someone who might recognize her. On several occasions, former friends from her social circle walked in, their laughter filling the diner. Nolwazi would quickly retreat to the kitchen, hiding her face. Her nights were spent in the abandoned car, and as the weeks turned into months, Nolwazi's health began to deteriorate. One day, she collapsed while cleaning tables. Mondlovu rushed to her aid, offering her food and a place to rest. Meanwhile, Nolwazi's mother, Bab'Ntuli, struggled with guilt. She secretly visited the diner one evening, slipping an envelope of money into Nolwazi's bag. But Bab'Ntuli discovered her secret and issued a harsh warning. "If you defy me again, you'll join her in the streets." Despite everything, Nolwazi remained determined to protect her unborn child. She began writing letters in a tattered diary, addressing them to her baby. One day she wrote, "I'll give you the life you deserve." Life in the streets was harsh for Nolwazi. Every night, she would return to the abandoned car behind the shopping mall, clutching her belly and whispering lullabies to her unborn child. Her only comfort was the thought of giving her baby a better life someday. The car had become her world, a small, rusted shell offering little protection from the cold nights and unpredictable weather. Nolwazi made a habit of folding her coat into a pillow, preserving it for her baby instead of using it for herself. When rainstorms hit, she would wrap herself in newspapers, shielding her belly with her arms as the water seeped into the car. At the diner, Nolwazi's days were grueling. Ndlovu, though strict, had a soft spot for Nolwazi and would often sneak her extra food. "Eat this," she said one day, sliding a bowl of soup across the counter. "You look like a strong wind could carry you away." Nolwazi offered a grateful smile but rarely spoke about her situation. Despite her efforts to remain invisible, some customers began to notice her. A group of young women who frequented the diner often stared and whispered, their mocking laughter echoing in Nolwazi's ears. One day, a familiar face walked in, a childhood friend, Untill. Nolwazi froze, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Untill didn't notice her at first, but when their eyes met, Nolwazi quickly turned away. She prayed Untill wouldn't recognize her in her faded uniform and tired appearance. Thankfully, Untill left without a word, but the encounter left Nolwazi shaken. As the months passed, Nolwazi's health continued to decline. She developed severe anemia, and her thin frame and pale complexion became impossible to ignore. Ndlovu, growing increasingly concerned, confronted her one evening. "You need to see a doctor," she said firmly. Nolwazi shook her head. "I can't afford it," she whispered. Ndlovu sighed and handed her some money. "Take this. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Though Nolwazi appreciated the gesture, she hesitated to accept charity. She was determined to stand on her own 2 feet, even if it meant enduring more hardship. One particularly stormy night, Nolwazi sat in the car, shivering as lightning lit up the sky. She clutched her diary, writing another letter to her baby. "You are my hope, my strength," she scribbled. "I will survive this for you." Little did she know, her life was about to take an unexpected turn. The storm raged on, and Nolwazi huddled in the corner of the car, tears streaming down her face. The sound of thunder masked the footsteps approaching her makeshift shelter. A man's voice broke through the darkness. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone a mix of concern and curiosity. Nolwazi flinched, clutching her belly. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. The man didn't move. "My name is Tabo," he said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." Tabo was a businessman who owned several hotels in the city. That night, he had been walking home when he spotted the faint glow of a candle flickering inside the car. Something about the scene compelled him to investigate. Nolwazi hesitated before finally meeting his gaze. Tabo's eyes softened as he noticed her swollen belly and the tattered coat draped over her shoulders. "You can't stay here," he said. "It's not safe." Despite her initial reluctance, Nolwazi allowed Tabo to guide her to his car. He handed her a warm blanket and drove her to one of his hotels. Once inside, Tabo offered her food and a room to stay in. Nolwazi ate in silence, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. She couldn't help but wonder why he was helping her. In the days that followed, Tabo visited Nolwazi regularly, bringing her meals and checking on her health. He eventually learned her name and recognized her family name. Memories of his past resurfaced. Years ago, he had approached Bab'Ntuli for a business loan and been rejected with disdain. Tabo's mind raced with conflicting emotions. Was this his chance to exact revenge? Or was it an opportunity to help someone who desperately needed it? As the storm outside subsided, so did the storm within Tabo. He decided to focus on the present rather than the past. One evening, he asked Nolwazi about her dreams. "I used to love interior design," she admitted, her eyes lighting up for the first time in months. "I dreamed of creating beautiful spaces that brought joy to people." Tabo smiled, sensing an opportunity to help her rebuild her life. "Perhaps you can still make that dream a reality," he said. Unbeknownst to Nolwazi, Tabo's kindness would become the foundation of her rise, transforming her from a broken woman into a force to be reckoned with. Nolwazi awoke in the hotel room, feeling a sense of security she hadn't experienced in months. The clean sheets and warm bed reminded her of the life she had lost. As she gazed out the window, she resolved to make the most of this second chance. Tabo returned later that morning, carrying a tray of breakfast. "Eat," he said, setting it on the small table. "You'll need your strength." While she ate, Tabo shared his story. He had once been homeless, driven to the streets after his family's business collapsed. "Someone gave me a chance," he said. "Now I'm giving you one." Touched by his vulnerability, Nolwazi hesitated before asking, "Why are you helping me?" Tabo's answer was simple. "Because I see potential in you." Over the next few weeks, Nolwazi began to regain her strength. Tabo encouraged her to revisit her passion for interior design. "Let's start small," he suggested one day. "Design a room in one of my hotels." Nolwazi's eyes widened. "I don't have any resources," she protested. Tabo waved her concern away. "Use what's here. Show me what you can do." Though hesitant, Nolwazi threw herself into the task. She spent hours sketching ideas, selecting furniture, and arranging decorations. The result was stunning, a room transformed into a warm, inviting space with vibrant African motifs and modern elegance. When Tabo saw the final design, he was speechless. "This is incredible," he said, marveling at her work. Encouraged by his praise, Nolwazi began designing other rooms in his hotels. Each project showcased her creativity and unique vision, gaining attention from guests and hotel staff alike. Word spread, and soon, people began asking about the designer behind the stunning transformations. One day, Tabo showed Nolwazi a series of social media posts praising her work. "You're becoming famous," he said with a grin. Nolwazi couldn't believe it. For the first time in months, she felt hope, not just for herself but for her unborn child. Unbeknownst to Nolwazi, her newfound success was catching the attention of people who had once shunned her. As Nolwazi's work gained recognition, the Ntuli family began to hear whispers of her name. At first, they dismissed it as a coincidence. How could their disgraced daughter, cast out with nothing, be associated with such acclaim? But the evidence was undeniable. A family friend showed them photos of Nolwazi's designs, now trending on social media. Bab'Ntuli scowled as he stared at the images. "This changes nothing," he declared, his pride refusing to waver. Nolwazi's mother, however, was less resolute. She had secretly visited shelters and hospitals for months, hoping to find her daughter. Seeing Nolwazi's success brought both relief and regret. One afternoon, Bab'Ntuli ventured into the city under the guise of running errands. She followed the trail of Nolwazi's name until she found herself standing outside one of Tabo's hotels. Inside, she caught a glimpse of her daughter, busy directing staff as they prepared to unveil another newly designed room. Bab'Ntuli's heart swelled with pride, but guilt quickly overshadowed it. She wanted to approach Nolwazi but feared rejection. Meanwhile, Nolwazi was unaware of her mother's presence. She was focused on her work, driven by the promise she had made to herself and her unborn child. Each design was a step closer to reclaiming her identity and proving to herself, and the world, that she was more than the shame her family had cast upon her. That evening, Tabo joined Nolwazi for dinner. "I saw someone watching you today," he said casually. Nolwazi frowned. "Who?" "I'm not sure," Tabo admitted. "But she looked familiar." Nolwazi dismissed the comment, too consumed by her projects to dwell on it. However, a seed of curiosity was planted. Back at the Ntuli household, tensions were rising. Bab'Ntuli's company was struggling financially, and he began to feel the weight of his decisions. Though he refused to admit it, a part of him wondered if casting Nolwazi out had been a mistake. The Ntuli family's world was beginning to crack, and Nolwazi's name was the wedge driving them apart. Rain lashed against the windows of the Ntuli home, mirroring the tension brewing within the family. Bab'Ntuli sat in his study, staring at the financial reports. His company, once a symbol of their family's legacy, was now on the brink of collapse. Deals had fallen through, investors had pulled out, and competitors loomed like vultures. Bab'Ntuli entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. "Have you considered reaching out to Nolwazi?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. Bab'Ntuli slammed his fist on the table. "I will not beg her. She disgraced this family." "But what if we were wrong?" Bab'Ntuli whispered. "What if she deserves another chance?" Bab'Ntuli's silence was deafening. Deep down, he knew his pride had blinded him, but admitting it was another matter. Meanwhile, Nolwazi's world was expanding. Her designs were not only admired but were also beginning to attract influential clients. Tabo encouraged her to showcase her work at an upcoming design expo in the city. "This is your moment," Tabo said as they walked through the hotel lobby. "You'll meet people who can take your career to the next level." Though hesitant, Nolwazi agreed. She spent weeks preparing, pouring her heart into every detail of her presentation. The day of the expo arrived, and Nolwazi stood before a packed audience, presenting her vision of blending traditional African aesthetics with modern luxury. Her passion shone through, captivating everyone in the room. In the audience, Bab'Ntuli sat in disguise, unable to resist seeing her daughter in action. She felt a swell of pride as she watched Nolwazi command the room. Her words filled with confidence and grace. After the presentation, Nolwazi was approached by an elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Mackay's, a prominent figure in the interior design industry. "Your work is remarkable," Mrs. Mackay said warmly. "I'd like to collaborate with you on a project." Overwhelmed with gratitude, Nolwazi accepted. Her journey was gaining momentum, but the echoes of her past still lingered. Back at the Ntuli home, Bab'Ntuli returned with news of Nolwazi's success. "She's extraordinary," she told Bab'Ntuli. "Our daughter is achieving what we never imagined." But Bab'Ntuli only grunted in response, his pride refusing to bend. The Ntuli family's downfall was accelerating. Bab'Ntuli's company was now the target of a hostile takeover, and his once loyal allies had turned their backs. The financial strain seeped into their home, creating cracks in the family's unity. One evening, Nolwazi received an unexpected visitor at the hotel, her younger sister Zandile. Dressed in simple clothes, Zandile looked nothing like the polished, confident woman Nolwazi remembered. "What are you doing here?" Nolwazi asked, her tone guarded. Zandile hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "We need your help," she admitted. "Baba's company is falling apart. He's too proud to say it, but we're losing everything." Nolwazi stared at her sister, a mix of emotions swirling within her. This was the same family that had cast her out, leaving her to fend for herself. "Why now?" she asked coldly. "Why come to me after everything you've done?" Zandile's voice cracked. "Because you're the only one who can save us. Please, Nolwazi. We were wrong, but Baba will never admit it." Nolwazi turned away, tears stinging her eyes. She thought of the night she had spent sleeping in a car, the humiliation she had endured, and the promises she had made to herself and her unborn child. Tabo, who had overheard the conversation, stepped forward. "This is your decision," he said gently. "But remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means taking control of your story." The next day, Nolwazi visited her old neighborhood, her emotions a mixture of anger and nostalgia. The Ntuli mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now looked worn and neglected. Bab'Ntuli greeted her at the gate, her face a mask of relief and regret. "Nolwazi, thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. Inside, the family gathered in the living room. Bab'Ntuli sat rigidly, his pride still intact despite the circumstances. Nolwazi stood before them, her presence commanding. "You threw me out," she began, her voice steady. "You left me to suffer. And now you want my help." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the pain they had caused. As Bab'Ntuli opened his mouth to respond, Nolwazi raised a hand. "If I help, it will be on my terms," she said firmly. "No more pride. No more shame. We do this my way." Bab'Ntuli's face hardened, but Montuli placed a hand on his arm. "We're ready to listen," she said softly. Nolwazi's journey had brought her full circle, but the road to redemption was just beginning. Nolwazi's offer to help her family was not a simple one. She stood firm in her decision to change the dynamic that had once been so rigid and unforgiving. For the first time, her family would have to humble themselves in a way they never had before. "Here's what we're going to do," Nolwazi announced to the family. "Baba, you will work at the same mall where I slept in my car. Ma, you will serve at the diner I worked in while pregnant. And all of you, my siblings included, will volunteer at women's shelters for a year. You'll live in low-income housing, no luxury, no privilege. This is the price of your pride." The room was silent. Bab'Ntuli's face tightened in disbelief, and his jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. His prideful nature fought against this humbling reality, but deep down, he knew that his daughter's success had come not only from talent but from the suffering he had inflicted on her. Montuli, ever the nurturing one, was the first to speak. "Nolwazi, this is too much. We can't do this." "Yes, you can," Nolwazi replied, her eyes hard but filled with determination. "You will do this because you owe it to yourselves. You owe it to me. You owe it to the family that you turned your back on. This isn't about charity. It's about understanding." Zandile, who had remained quiet up until now, spoke up. "What if we don't make it? What if we fail?" "If you fail, it will be because you've learned nothing," Nolwazi said firmly. "And I'll leave you to it. But if you succeed, you'll have the chance to rebuild your lives, not because of your wealth, but because of your hearts." The next morning, Bab'Ntuli donned a janitor's uniform for the first time in his life. As he walked into the shopping mall, his mind was clouded with resentment, but he couldn't ignore the humbling truth. The once proud businessman who had controlled everything now swept floors in a mall that his daughter had walked through in humiliation. Montuli reluctantly donned an apron and worked the same diner where Nolwazi had been forced to serve food while pregnant. She couldn't help but feel the sting of her daughter's words. Every shift in the diner was a reminder of how she had failed as a mother. Meanwhile, Nolwazi's success continued to rise. Her designs for various hotels and businesses garnered attention from prestigious clients. She had a platform now, one that had brought her not just career advancement but also recognition as a formidable force in the industry. Yet, as her success grew, she often found herself lost in thought, reflecting on the wounds of her past. Despite her accomplishments, the ache of abandonment and betrayal still lingered. In the evenings, she would sit in her small apartment, staring out of the window, imagining her family in their new, modest life. The thought of them struggling, humbling themselves, was a bittersweet form of redemption. But it wasn't easy. They had begun their journey of transformation, and while Nolwazi could see small glimmers of change, she knew the real test had just begun. As the months passed, the Ntuli family experienced both growth and pain. Bab'Ntuli, despite his initial resistance, began to develop a new understanding of humility. Every day, he worked alongside people who had once been invisible to him. He saw firsthand the daily struggles of those who lived paycheck to paycheck, never knowing when the next crisis would hit. In the evenings after his shift at the mall, he would sit in his small apartment, thinking about the lessons he had learned. He realized how wrong he had been to dismiss his daughter's worth, not just as a designer but as a person who had faced hardship with courage. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he met a man in the parking lot who had been sweeping the floors. The man, who looked to be in his late 40s, greeted him with a simple, "How's the day treating you, sir?" Bab'Ntuli, too proud to ask for help, simply nodded and walked away. But the man's words stuck with him. "There's no shame in hard work. Just ask the person who has to do it." Montuli's time at the diner wasn't any easier. She had become acquainted with some of the regular customers who, like her daughter, lived in poverty. One woman, a mother of two, opened up to Bab'Ntuli one night, telling her about the difficulties of living paycheck to paycheck. "You think it's easy for us?" the woman asked. "We fight just to keep a roof over our heads." It was in these conversations that Bab'Ntuli began to understand the depths of her own failure. She had turned her back on Nolwazi because she was embarrassed, because it wasn't convenient for her. But now, serving food to struggling families, Bab'Ntuli realized the true cost of pride. As for the siblings, they faced their own challenges. Untill found herself volunteering at a women's shelter, listening to the stories of women who had been abused, abandoned, and betrayed. She began to see her own life in a new light, recognizing how easily she had taken her privilege for granted. The family's journey of transformation reached its emotional peak during a weekly therapy session. Bab'Ntuli, for the first time, allowed himself to cry. "I failed you," he said. His voice choked with emotion. "I failed all of you. I was too proud to see how much I hurt you, and I lost the most important thing in my life." Tears fell from Bab'Ntuli's eyes as well. "We failed her too. We failed our daughter because we were too scared of what others would think. And I would give anything to change that." The walls they had built up over the years crumbled. The family's awakening was painful, but it was necessary. And as they sat together, raw and vulnerable, Nolwazi walked in. She had come not to gloat, but to finally reconcile. "I've waited a long time for this," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." As the family embraced, Nolwazi knew that this was only the beginning. Her family's redemption was a long road, but she was no longer walking it alone.